Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today it's with great pleasure that my host is Dr. Valentina Covaci. Valentina is a lecturer at the University of Bucharest, and she works on Roman Catholic theology, or that's the department she's working in, but she focuses very much on medieval Jerusalem. And we're going to see today, first of all, what is medieval Jerusalem, which is a very large term. And we're going to talk about communities, particularly the Latin and the Greeks in the Holy City, as well as Western Pilgrims traveling in the very early period, particularly during the Mamluk's era. But first of all, Valentina, welcome.
Thank you for the invite. It's such a joy to be on Jerusalem Unplugged, which I listen to weekly. So I'm very happy to be here and to speak about medieval Jerusalem, and not only.
Thank you. So the first question is, what is your Jerusalem? What is your connection with the city? How, from Romania, you start working on Jerusalem?
Yeah. So I came to Jerusalem, first of all, through academia, because I did my PhD at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And I was part of a larger project dedicated to the Thefranciscan Presence in Jerusalem in medieval times. And my part of the project dealt with the rituals of the Franciscans in Jerusalem. And through this, starting to study their ceremonies, etc., I got very much into liturgy, and particularly into liturgical encounters between the Latin Church and the Greek Orthodox Church. So my connection to Jerusalem is first of all academic, but then during my PhD, I actually got to live for a while in Jerusalem to do some field work, to actually witness this liturgy at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and not exclusively. So my path went from manuscript to practice, to see what was still going on more than 1,000 years after the period I started to study the liturgies of Jerusalem. So, but then, yeah, I would say that I also have a personal connection now with Jerusalem, thanks to my stays in the city.
You work on medieval Jerusalem. So as I said, probably this is the first question, because I'm curious to understand, what does it mean medieval Jerusalem, given that medieval, according to historiography in general, it covers from essentially the collapse of the Roman Empire to the Renaissance, which is nearly a millennium. So when we talk about medieval Jerusalem, what does that mean? What kind of period we're looking at?
For Jerusalem, I would go for a slightly different periodization, not necessarily from the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, because of course Jerusalem is in the Eastern Mediterranean and it was part of the Eastern Roman Empire. So I would place the beginning of course, which is an arbitrary chronology anyhow, but I would place the beginning of the medieval period in Jerusalem when the political ties with Byzantium were cut, which happened in 638, when the city of Jerusalem was surrounded by the Patriarch Sophronius of the Melkite Church, of the Greek Orthodox Church, to the conquering Muslim armies of Umar, of Caliph Umar. So that's where I would place the beginning of the Middle Ages in Jerusalem, and I think you can place the end of the Middle Ages in Jerusalem in 1517, when two events happen. First of all, the Ottomans conquer Palestine and they take over Jerusalem, and also this coincides with the beginning of the Protestant Reformation in Europe, which very much changes the dynamic of pilgrimage, at least when it comes to Western pilgrimage and to the numbers of Western pilgrims coming to Jerusalem. So in 1517, definitely a new period starts in Jerusalem. So I would say that can be seen as the end of the Middle Ages.
It's very interesting, and also it shows that the term medieval is very artificial, and we just use it depending on the context. It's convenient, but again, the Middle Ages for Europeans is not the Middle Ages for the Islamic civilization, as they were just emerging and in fact conquering most of the known world at that time. I'm curious about something though, again, keeping it general, but can you give us a sense of who were the people of Jerusalem in this kind of long period of time? Obviously, we understand that the city changed hands several times with different rulers, but if you can give us a sense of how the city was transformed also in terms of its urban structure throughout this period of time.
Yes. Ethnically, I think they are the inhabitants of Jerusalem are quite difficult to distinguish, at least for the early periods. But as always, you can distinguish them by religion. So at the moment of the conquest of Jerusalem by the Muslim armies, of course, the population of Jerusalem was made up of Oriental Christians, of Melkites, mainly because Jerusalem is one of those cities that keep their allegiance with Byzantium, and they are one of the only Chalcedonian churches in the area. But apart from Melkite Christians, there were Syriac Christians and Christians belonging to the so-called Nestorian Church, etc. So all sorts of Christians pertaining to various Oriental denominations. This started to change gradually after the Muslim conquest of Jerusalem, but it was not a sudden or a dramatic change. This was a gradual process for the Muslim population to settle and to become a majority in the city of Jerusalem. But throughout the medieval period, there was a constant Christian presence in the city. Of course, boosted up during the period of the Crusades, with significant Latin presence, which was lacking before, because before the Crusades, the Latins were present only in the form of pilgrims coming from the West and a few monks scattered on the Mount of Olives. So basically, that was the Latin presence before the Crusades, and also the Crusades welcomed Christians into the city of Jerusalem, so that their reign actually boosted the presence of the Christian population. This was to a certain degree overthrown by the reconquest of Jerusalem by Saladin in 1187. But still, although the city became majority Muslim again, there was a significant Christian presence throughout this period. Not so much a Jewish presence. The presence of the Jewish population is hinted at, but not in great numbers. Definitely a smaller presence than the Christian and the Muslim one.
After this overview, I really want to go back to your original work about the Franciscan presence in the Holy Land. I mean, nowadays, obviously, visitors can go and visit the custody of the Holy Land, which essentially means, you know, the Franciscans took the title of the custodians, the protector of the holy places. This goes back to the time of St. Francis of Assisi. And I was wondering if you can give us a sense of the relationship between the Franciscans, starting from St. Francis himself, and Jerusalem.
Yes. Very early on in the history of the Franciscan order, St. Francis settled as a point of Franciscan spirituality their role in missionary work, particularly among the Muslims. So very early on, he sent brothers to the east, and this province of the Holy Land was established early on in the history of the Franciscan order. However, the Custodia Terresante, the custody of the Holy Land as we know it today, dates from the first half of the 14th century, when the right of the presence was bought for the brothers by the king and queen of Naples. So they came back as the exclusive representatives of the Roman Church in Jerusalem after the Latin clergy were thrown out by Saladin in 1187. So between 1187 and 1333, we have this hiatus of Latin presence. The Latin priests were allowed only sporadically to celebrate in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and this also restricted the presence of Latin pilgrims coming to Jerusalem. But with 1333, when the right of a presence is bought from the Mamluk Sultan by the King and Queen of Naples, we have approximately 20 Franciscan brothers settled in Jerusalem. And they start to organize the Western Pilgrimage and to celebrate the Latin Mass service daily at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And they last in Jerusalem ever since.
So this is indeed a very long, history of between Jerusalem and at large the Holy Land and the Franciscans, which obviously is not going to change anytime soon, given that this is like one of the most solid institutions in the city. I was wondering, I mean, given the fact that the Franciscans have been in the city for such a long time, what do you see in terms of like their contribution to the city itself? I'll tell you my perception. I've been working with the Franciscans, and I've been obviously visiting Franciscan places, and at times I had the perception that there's a disconnect. There is the Franciscans and there is the city. But then also you can see that there are Franciscans who are actually part of the city itself. And so there is kind of like some sort of a paradox, like they are in the city, but they're not part of the city. But this may be only superficial. So I was wondering about the fact that you've been working on the Franciscan for such a long time, and that you covered a long period of time. How do you see them as part of a city?
Yes, I actually have the contrary impression, because I see how they changed the topography in Jerusalem, at least the sacred topography of Jerusalem, because we all know of this Via Crucis street in Jerusalem, and that's pretty much a Franciscan creation, because it was born out of Franciscan devotion of the ritual memorialization of the last part of Christ, from Pilate's place to the Calvary. And sometimes in the 14th century, they started to walk this ritual route through Jerusalem, through Mamluk Jerusalem, which was, of course, going against the rules to have this sort of procession with pilgrims. But they still started to memorialize various points in the Passion of Christ and place it on the map, place it at certain points on this path of the Via Crucis. So this is how this street actually was born in Jerusalem, and how this ritual that we can actually see today still emerged. So this is at least one instance when their presence marked forever the topography of Jerusalem. Also, if we come towards recent history, they opened recently a museum. So that's, as far as I know, is not a particular museum anymore, and which is remarkable, because if we look at other Christian denominations, they keep their museums closed most of the time. So the Franciscans are putting their collections out there and actually inviting people to see their history in Jerusalem and their objects. And also I know that nowadays they work a lot with the Christian community in Jerusalem. and they support all sorts of projects like schools. And I know that they are buying or restoring houses for Christians in Jerusalem, at least for, I imagine, only for Latin Christians, but I might be wrong on this. So yeah, I think they are pretty involved in the city. And also they are appropriated the city through their rituals all the time, because of course whoever spent any amount of time in Jerusalem has to bump into a Franciscan-led procession in the old city. So I think this was a manner from the very beginning of their presence, even under the Mamluk rule and later on under the Ottoman rule, to appropriate the landscape of the city. Because if you walk it ritually, this is a manner of claiming it for your brand of Christianity.
That's fascinating. And I must ask, given the Franciscans essentially invented, probably St. Francis himself invented the idea of a nativity, which in Italian we call presepio, so the representation of the birth of Jesus. But as you mentioned, also the Franciscans created this idea of locating the Via Crucis, so the path that Jesus walked in his final day. And because you work on liturgy, I was wondering, how did that come about, and what is the Via Crucis really about? Is that a real historical representation, or which sometimes people think it is, or is even from the beginning was like just a spiritual sort of a path for people visiting Jerusalem?
It was both, because it developed as a spiritual exercise in Western Europe, and because the Franciscans had this propensity towards meditation on the Passion of Christ, which is a general change and a significant change in Western spirituality on the whole in the 14th century, thanks to the Franciscan order, thanks to their specific brand of spirituality. This sort of exercise was somehow placed in the real topography of Jerusalem by them. But this sort of exercise of remembering ritually the Passion of Christ already existed in the West. And there are a couple of people working on this, like Catherine Rudy from St. Andrews. But what the Franciscans did, of course, they place it in the real topography of Jerusalem. But that doesn't mean that they stopped the spiritual part, the spiritual remembering. Because, for instance, Franciscans who went to Jerusalem, they did the Jerusalem pilgrimage. When returning back to Western Europe, they started to recreate Jerusalem in Italy or in the Low Countries, etc. And they wrote special guidebooks for the virtual pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So this is not really a liturgical activity, because it's supposed to take you throughout the city without the celebration of the Mass. But it's sort of extra liturgical ritual of commemorialization and reliving the Passion of Christ, which was very much in the Franciscan spirituality of the time.
And I'm curious about an article that you wrote appropriating the holy Franciscan processions in Jerusalem in the 14th, 15th century. I must admit that I didn't know much about it. So I was wondering, what was the purpose of these processions and how did this procession work?
Yes. So that's in that particular article, I speak about two aspects. First of all, how they managed to still process throughout Jerusalem at the time of the Mamluk rule in Jerusalem, which of course was a Muslim rule, and which came with certain restrictions. First of all, you can't display your Christian rituals in a Muslim city, but a close reading of the sources actually points out that they still did it, particularly on the outskirts of Jerusalem. For instance, they would keep this Palm Sunday procession from Bethany up to the Golden Gate. Of course, the Golden Gate was walled up by Saladin, so they couldn't enter the city in procession, but they will still have this adjusted Palm Sunday procession. They will also process on Mount Zion between the churches that were restored by Franciscans on Mount Zion. So there was still definitely processional activity in this Muslim city, processions that, of course, they were not supposed to perform at all, but they still did. And the other point that I talked about in this article refers to the Latin appropriation of the space of the Holy Sepulchre, because the Franciscans instituted something which is called still today the Processio Quotidiana, the daily procession, which nowadays is at 4 o'clock every day of the week. And that goes back to the 14th century. So they are processing throughout the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, stopping at the chapels belonging to other denominations, belonging to the Greeks, belonging to the Armenians. And that's part of their mission at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or their service at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So that's a way of imposing and displaying their brand of Christianity in the eyes of the other Christians present at the most important church in Christianity.
You actually anticipated my question, because I remember I attended and I actually walked with the Franciscans a number of his processions, which are literally within the church itself, and it was fascinating. And I remember feeling the tension, which I think is part of in a sense of a spectacle too, between the various denominations, whether the Greek Orthodox or the Copts and so forth. Even though I feel like obviously today there's like a lot more respect and mutual cooperation than it was in the past, but still I think there is a sense of ownership within the church, and I think that's an important aspect of the Holy Sepulchre indeed. Now you mentioned that obviously these processions started during the Mamluk period. And as you mentioned, obviously, the Mamluk is an Islamic ruler, which obviously dominated not just Jerusalem, but a larger region. I was wondering, since you wrote about Western Pilgrims visiting Jerusalem in that particular period of time, who were these pilgrims? And if you have any chance to tell us perhaps stories about these people and how were they from, how they traveled, and what was the purpose? Did they go back, or they wanted to just stay in Jerusalem, maybe dying in Jerusalem?
Yes. Actually, this was a very fine-tuned affair during the Mamluk times, the Western Pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and it was coordinated by the Franciscans and by the Franciscan houses in Western Europe, particularly in Italy, because the pilgrimage ships would leave from Genoa and Venice, but most of them from Venice twice a year. And all these pilgrims were organized on what the sources call nationes, nations. So people from Germany and the Low Countries will come under the name of the German nation, and the Italians will come as the Italian nation. And probably the Hungarians will also join the German nation. So they were organized on these nations. They will travel in the same ship, but once they landed they arrived in Jaffa, they will be assigned an interpreter for their own language, because of course all the rituals would be in Latin and all the sermons would be preached in Latin to them. But if they had assigned an interpreter of their own language, which would usually be a Franciscan from that particular nation, so German Franciscan for the German-speaking nation, and an Italian Franciscan for the Italians, and a Franciscan who spoke some sort of version of French for the French nation. So they will take care of them and translate particularly the sermons for them, because the ritual would usually not be translated because the ritual was in Latin in Western Europe anyway. And in Jerusalem, they will be assigned to pilgrim hostels, one of them on Mount Zion, and they will be divided women and men. Most of the pilgrims were actually men. Apart from the usual pilgrims that we would expect, the monks and nuns, etc., there were many members of the nobility making the Jerusalem pilgrimage because they could afford it, because it was quite costly. Monks would also sometimes travel at someone else's expense. A noble or someone would pay for their pilgrimage, for their passing of the sea. And they would be taken together, all these nations of pilgrims and their interpreters, around the holy sites in Jerusalem and the Holy Land at large. Many of them would actually make the trip to St. Catherine's in the Sinai, so quite far off from Jerusalem, or to the Dead Sea, or to the sites in Galilee. It depended on the context, on how well the Mamluks actually controlled their territory, because there, in the pilgrimage accounts, we hear a lot about bandits, that they would rob the pilgrims, etc., etc. And of course, they would pay and be assigned some sort of bodyguards and interpreter of Arabic. So they were called Turkomans. So they had this protection, but sometimes the Mamluk authorities, they didn't control their territories so well. So in order to avoid these incidents, particularly if there was a war going on, they would avoid going to St. Catherine's in the Sinai and just restrain their pilgrimage to Jerusalem and the surrounding areas.
I was curious about, these pilgrims, obviously, they visited. And what do we know about what they brought back to Europe, whether it was Italy, Spain, or France? How did they represent Jerusalem? Because one of the perception, particularly working on the later period, is that we, in general, we Europeans, have been massively influenced by the travelers, these medieval individuals, and how they told the story of their trip and how they saw Jerusalem, and indeed also how they represented the local population, Arabs, Christians, Jews, and Muslims.
So there was a massive trade in the Middle Ages as well in pilgrimage tokens. So they would try, pilgrims coming back from Jerusalem would try to bring something of the holiness of the city back to their place. Most of them consisted of items that we also, or a lot of people still bring back today from Jerusalem. Some ground or holy water from Jordan, or incense and things like that. So this is a very old trade, or some small icons or pilgrimage badges, something that would remind them of Jerusalem. There are also the cases when Western pilgrims try to replicate the monuments of Jerusalem. So they would measure, for instance, they would take measures of the slab of the Holy Tomb inside the edicule and recreate it in a church in Western Europe. So they would have this sort of cenotaph, a mock Holy Tomb inside the church dedicated to the Holy Sepulchre somewhere in the West. Or they would try to recreate the entire sacred landscape of Jerusalem, as it happened, for instance, in Italy, northern Italy, at Varallo, where on the Sacro Monte di Varallo, you have the replica of Jerusalem at large, with the Mount of Olives and the sites of the Passion, and of course the replica of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre itself. When it comes to their impression of the local population, there are quite a few pilgrims that actually do speak about the local population, about the Arabs particularly, because they buy things from them inside the Holy Sepulchre as well. They speak of this trade that is going on during the Mass, which is not an unusual sight when it comes to medieval liturgy. So they are buying things from them, and they describe the way they dress, and of course there is a lot of what they are saying is informed by polemics. For instance, why they are wearing beards, and why they eat what they eat, and why their women are veiled, etc., etc. So this is part of the polemical writing. It doesn't come necessarily from direct knowledge. They are just replicated what they read or what they were told about the Muslims, for instance, at large. When it comes to the local Christians, there is a similar situation. They are just sort of repeating things from the polemical literature, but also some of the monks, for instance, or the priests, or people who are trained in theology and are making the Jerusalem pilgrimage. They are better informed, and they try to engage with the other denominations on a more profound level, and explain why they are doing things in the way they do, going back to the theological differences, going back to the era of the councils, when this separation between Chalcedonians and non-Chalcedonian churches was created. So it depends on the pilgrim, really, and on his depth of knowledge.
I'm going to use an analogy for which you're probably going to be shouting at me. I don't know if you remember the movie with Orlando Bloom, Kingdom of Heaven, which was like a very famous movie, obviously full of historical mistakes. But there was an interesting question at some point when the main character finally gets to Jerusalem and is asking, what is Jerusalem? I mean, he's really trying to figure out why all of these people are fighting and dying for the city. And I was wondering if in your work you ever found out what were the pilgrims really looking for, why they were putting themselves in danger of dying in this very perilous trip. But nevertheless, they made it there. And then they made the trip backwards, and they're really trying to rebuild that Jerusalem, like you said, in this place in northern Italy, around Bergamo. But also remember this amazing church in Bologna, the 7 churches where you have another representation of Jerusalem, and many other places. What is that they were looking for?
They were looking for something they were told to look for, because most Christians would be familiar with Jerusalem in the shape of the heavenly Jerusalem from the Apocalypse. But when undertaking this pilgrimage, they will go through some sort of training, because on the ship and when on the way up to Jerusalem from Jaffa, they would be instructed by their guides, by their Franciscan guides, on what the earthly Jerusalem was. But their earthly Jerusalem was not this backwater town in the Mamluk Empire. It was the Jerusalem of the Herodian times, or the Jerusalem from the life of Jesus. So that's what they came to see, and that's what they are talking about. They are not talking about what they are actually seeing, but about what they are supposed to see. For instance, when they are approaching Jerusalem, and on this mountain before Jerusalem, this so-called Mount of Joy, they stop and they look over Jerusalem for the first time. They are supposed to sing, and they are encouraged to sing this hymn, Urs Beata Jerusalem, which of course refers to a psalm of joy, etc., etc. So this is how they see Jerusalem, not through the dirty little town that it was at the time, not as that, but they see it through biblical eyes, through what they heard of at the Mass, or through what they read in the Bible.
I guess that didn't change for quite some time, because obviously even pilgrims in the late 19th century and early 20th century had the same experience, which brings me to ask you, do you have any sense of what kind of relationship these pilgrims had with the local population, other than obviously the translation and maybe the accommodation? Is there any sense if they relate to each other, or they were completely, basically strangers to each other?
If the pilgrims were mostly strangers, because their interaction with the local population was intermediated. It was not a direct relation. So they would approach someone local, or they would be approached through the translator, or through the Franciscan guide. So there was actually no direct connection, because of course the language barrier, but also the religion barrier. So there were many barriers to overcome, and too little time spent in Jerusalem in order for these barriers to be overcome. But for those who settled in Jerusalem, and there are a few of them, not so many, of course, as in Crusader times, but there are people who settle in Jerusalem either to become themselves Franciscans, or to be servants in the pilgrim hostels, in the Western Pilgrim hostels built in Jerusalem. They develop a relation with the local population, but that doesn't go beyond the transactional nature, or beyond buying and selling things and things like that. There is a more profound there are more profound relations developed with the local Christians, because, as I said, many of these people who are staying for longer in Jerusalem, they are theologians, so they are very much intrigued by whatever these people are doing. Maybe some of them actually do speak Greek or Syriac, so they can come to a deeper knowledge of their rituals, about which they are actually totally fascinated, and then describe them in detail. And you can actually, coming from the perspective of a 21st century liturgist with all the insight of knowledge, you can actually check what they are saying, and it's pretty accurate. So they have they acquire real knowledge in Jerusalem about these other Christian denominations.
Now, we have not much time left, but I want to ask you something which is the very heart of your work, this question of the liturgy. Now, liturgy is something very religious that connects with the word of the spirituality, but obviously in Jerusalem, this is very important. And so I was wondering if you can give us a sense of what's the relationship between the liturgical aspect of religion, so the idea of praying, clothing, behavior we talked about, indeed, processions, and the seat itself. Are they connected? Is there a way of representing only the spiritual, or there's also a material aspect to it?
There is definitely a material aspect in the liturgy of Jerusalem, and that's a feature that develops from the very beginning in Christian Jerusalem, because the nature of Jerusalem's liturgy is very peculiar. Because very early on in the Christian centuries, in Jerusalem developed the so-called stational liturgy. What stational liturgy? Stational liturgy is structured on processions that go from one station, from one stopping point to the other, and these stops are associated with moments from the life of Christ. So already from the 4th century, under the Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem, we see this stational liturgy developing in Jerusalem, and all the manuscripts attest to its development up to the Muslim conquest. So, of course, if the liturgy becomes the affair of the entire city, and it has to become, since it takes the liturgy throughout all these stops scattered around Jerusalem, then there is a definite connection between the urban development of Jerusalem and Christian liturgy. Of course, this came to a halt with the Muslim conquest of Jerusalem. because, of course, as dhimmi, as a tolerated population, Christians were not allowed to display the rituals. But at least as I witnessed in the research I done on Western pilgrimage accounts, there are many, many hints that these things were still going on, but on a reduced scale.
We got to know each other through Twitter.
Yeah.
Mainly because you were posting pictures of a fascinating place, which is the Holy Sepulchre, but more importantly, of some of the details, which are these graffiti. Now, anyone visiting the Holy Sepulchre cannot but see these graffiti, and there are different graffiti throughout the church. Mostly these are crosses, but you also have names written here and there. So now I'm curious, can you tell us anything about these graffitis? Who made them? Why they were made? One previous guest mentioned that actually it might have been only very few people, but they produced a large number of the same graffiti. And I was wondering if it may be true, or maybe there's something more to it.
Yeah, that explanation can apply to the graffiti on the staircase going from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre down to the Chapel of Saint Helena. This looks like the professional hand of a mason who was paid to do that for pilgrims. But in the columns on the portal at the entrance of the Holy Sepulchre, you can see the name of individuals written. So that was a very personal mark. So they really wanted to inscribe their names somewhere where it could be seen by the other pilgrims, presumably, because only other Westerners could read the Latin script. And there are also all these coats of arms scattered throughout the Holy Sepulchre. So I would say, yeah, that there are many types of graffiti. There are this mass-produced graffiti, probably by a professional mason, but also the personal marks. Incidentally, they were not supposed to sign their name on the walls because there are many instructions that were preserved coming from the custos, from the head Franciscan in Jerusalem, in their initial sermon addressed to the pilgrims when he welcomed them. We know that he instructed them not to sign their name on the walls, but of course they still they did, because they spent the night in the church. So during the night they would get up to all sorts of things, among which inscribing their names on the walls. There are also some lesser known graffiti, and I'm trying to write an article on that, and I will call them the liturgical graffiti. If you go up to the roof, or where now you can find the Ethiopian section, there are still some graffiti looking like consecration crosses. So they are coming from the time when the church was the Crusader church was consecrated in the 12th century. So I'm particularly interested in how the liturgy actually got inscribed on the walls, and I can actually trace some of this graffiti around the church. So I'm hoping to finish this article soon.
And we hope to read it soon, because the question of a graffiti is fascinating, given the fact that they're there, and there is sort of, I guess, the contemporary trend, which was the same back then, not to leave marks. But then you look at them and you feel like nearly compelled somewhere to write down your name if you visit as a pilgrim. And in fact, you find graffitis that have been there for obviously millennia, but also maybe just written just a few decades ago. So obviously people still keep leaving their names in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I have one last question. Is there anything that I didn't ask, but that you feel we should have talked about?
Not really. I think we did it justice to medieval Jerusalem for the amount of time that we had, and I'm very pleased to have been able to talk to you about this fascinating period in the history of the city.
This was Valentina Covaci, lecturer at the University of Bucharest, and an expert on medieval Jerusalem, but more importantly about the liturgy that was basically used in the Catholic Church, in the Holy Sepulchre, in other holy places around Jerusalem and Palestine. Valentina, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.